Like I said, I want it to be a bit of a 101 for people. So I want to send this show around to people who I think maybe haven't thought about money enough. So I want to work through some of the basics with you. I want to help people understand the nature of what makes good money, what makes bad money. And then I want to dig into the uses of money, because I hadn't really considered it in terms of, consume, save, invest, and share, which is in your article, which we will share in the show notes. I know I do it. I know I use money for that, but I hadn't considered them individually and what makes good money for those different use cases. But I think it's a good starting point to talk about the key aspects of money. And VJ Boyapati's article, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, has that grid, which I think is fantastic.
I agree.
So when we talk, and I'll share that in the show notes as well, but when we talk about types of money, Bitcoin, fiat, and if anyone listening doesn't know what fiat is, it's dollars, pounds, euros, etc., and gold. It's gold, fiat, and Bitcoin. We talk about these properties and how each form of money is suitable for those. So do you want to run through them and explain what makes good money and what makes bad money?
Sure. And as you point out, this has been highlighted by VJ. Robert Breedlove's done a lot of work on this. Safety's done a lot of work on this. It's kind of like going through the properties of what makes good money and how they kind of compare to each other. And so you want like a list of criteria. So the whole purpose of money compared to an investment or something like that is that you want it to be liquid, safe, fungible. So if I buy a house or a specific company as an investment, that is something that is risky and that is something that is non-liquid and fungible. Like it's a specific thing. It's hard, it's a hassle for me to transfer it to someone else. That's kind of either a long-term bet or long-term savings or a specific plan to grow my investment with risk of loss. Whereas with money, it's kind of the opposite. I want like a low-risk battery of storing income now so that I can expend it in the future or share it or give it away or whatever I want to do. And so it's got to be liquid. It's got to be something that I can just easily transfer to someone. It's got to be something that is easily divisible, fungible, so that all the units are either identical or nearly identical. And it's got to be something that holds its value that I want to hold it longer term. And then I want to add other things, like you want it to be verifiable. You want it to be portable, and there's multiple ways to break that down. You can kind of look at different monies and like VJ did, for example, you can score them on the different aspects, right? So for example, gold holds its value pretty well long term, right? Because gold's got a very, very low inflation rate, meaning the amount of gold that exists above ground grows at a very, very slow rate historically, and there's a good reason for that. Whereas other types of commodities can grow very quicker. And so gold ends up being a very good store of value, but it has shortcomings in terms of portability, divisibility, verifying that what you actually own is gold, like the ease of being able to do that. Whereas when you look at something like the dollar, they've made advances for how easily you can send it around, right? Because it's you can have digital representations of it, and you can it's very easy to move around. But of course, the downside is that there's no constraint on how much they can print, other than kind of self-imposed restraint that is kind of meant to keep guardrails on the system and it, stop it from hyperinflating. So there's kind of guardrails on it, but they're self-imposed. And so over time, in practical terms, the rate of new dollar creation is much faster than the rate of new gold creation, right? So when you compare those, you think, okay, those are interesting. We obviously have to pay them for tax purposes. We have to, have some working capital to use them. They're liquid. The government specifically does their best to try to control the volatility at the exchange of devaluation, but they try to control the volatility of it. And so there's advantages, but they're not a great long-term place to store capital. And so when you go down the list, each type of money has shortcomings. And when you look at something like Bitcoin, it's interesting because the innovation there is that it kind of took the best properties of gold and fiat and mixed them together. So you have the slow monetary inflation rate of gold. In the long run, it's even less because eventually, the inflation rate trends towards zero, right, with Bitcoin. And you have that scarcity. But then you also have the better divisibility, better portability, and better verification. And so in many ways, it's across the board better than most other monies, with a couple of weaknesses relative to, it's still relatively untested. It's got 13 years of testing, 13 years of monetization. It's smaller than dollars or gold, so it's less liquid, far more volatile, less widely held, less widely accepted. And so what we can describe it as is an emerging money. And all anyone has to do is kind of look at the properties of it and determine if that's something that they want to hold relative to other monies, if that's something that's valuable to them. And I consider it so a lot of people will still kind of put it in the speculation camp or the investment camp. And I think it's a reasonable way to interpret it, because you're betting that the way it's behaved for 13 years and the properties it's had for 13 years are going to continue. So you've analyzed the probability of this occurring. You're making some sort of future judgment about this relatively new system. So that makes sense. But on the other hand, you can literally use it as insurance, because it's one of the few types of monies that you can easily self-custody. It's more portable than other types of monies. And we've seen this throughout emerging markets, right? It's easy to have, it's hard to move across borders with gold or physical cash. It's hard to transfer bank money around the world. But Bitcoin's something that you can literally self-custody and pretty much move wherever you want. And so I don't think the world fully realizes its properties yet and what that means.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about VJ's chart is the way he grades each form of money, that can change over time.
Yes.
But one thing I wonder if is missing, and perhaps is missing to the benefit of Bitcoin, is volatility. And I think price volatility is something which is helpful to understand in consideration for this, because if you look at the chart, or you look at VJ's chart, to me it implies, oh, well, that's the best form of money. It can do every single thing I want. Therefore, I should hold all my money in Bitcoin. But there's a risk to that because of volatility. And I always felt like if you wanted to make a decision about which forms, maybe multiple forms of money, there's argument to hold a basket of Bitcoin, gold, and maybe dollars. And I know that's heresy with some Bitcoiners, but I think that you can make a solid argument if you wanted to plan long term. You could have a mix, but to consider that mix, I think volatility should be considered. Do you think that's fair or not?
I think it's a huge variable, especially for medium of exchange and unit of account, right? So basically, I would describe Bitcoin as an emerging money. It's a 13-year-old money, right? So it doesn't have the track record or the size of those other monies. And because it's a smaller market, it has more volatility. It's got basically a bigger range of outcomes for how it could look in 10 years compared to, say, gold, right? So because there's a bigger gap of expectations about what this could become, the volatility is very large. In addition, because it's a smaller market, less liquidity, even though it's got quite a bit of liquidity, it's got less liquidity than say, the dollar market or the gold market. And that's because it's smaller. And so, if a Michael Saylor comes in, they can potentially move the market. Whereas if you have a handful of hedge funds, fast money deciding to sell it because of whatever macro factor they're looking at, that can also move the market. And also because it's known for good returns, there's even though leverage in the space is actually small relative to market cap or other ways of looking at it, there's individual parts of the market that are extremely leveraged, and those easily get liquidated when you have big moves to the upside or downside, which exacerbates volatility. And so it's kind of, people are betting on it in a way they don't bet on, say, gold and things like that, or at least not at this scale. And so that adds to volatility. And one way to think about fiat currencies is they try to optimize for low volatility, but then the sacrifice they make is devaluation, right? So they kind of have this manual adjustment mechanism where if you get deflation, they want to print a lot more. If they start getting inflation, they try their best to throttle that back. And they've had mixed success with that. But basically, you never really have a case where developed market currency is 50% less useful the next year, right? Whereas that can happen with Bitcoin, even more so. Now, in extreme historical events, even those fiat currencies, they break down. So they go decades and decades and decades without having a major volatility event. And then you get like a 1933 event where it's just, it's practically cut in half. Or you have emerging markets go through this far more often. The Egyptian pound had a month where it just cut in half about 5 years ago. And so that kind of thing is common throughout the world, unfortunately. But in developed markets, from year to year, the volatility is low. And that, combined with the fact that it's recognized as legal tender, makes it a useful form of kind of like near-term money that you can save it. It's going to be worth roughly the same in 6 weeks, and you kind of go about your day. And that matters for people where their incomes and their expenses are very close, right? So if you're living in a country and you're making $400 a month, and your expenses are $400 a month, you can't like risk holding a lot of your assets or whatever assets you might have in something that can go up 50% or go down 50% during that time. You pretty much have to have a stable amount because you have no margin for error. Whereas, of course, if you have a large pool of capital, you have a better ability to withstand volatility. So it's kind of a privilege to be able to accept volatility for harder, better money in the long term.
Well, Alex Gladstein talks a lot about this in certain markets, that tether is much more important than Bitcoin. Turkey, what the inflation rate? Did I see it's over 100% now? I can't.
It was very, very high.
Yeah.
I think it was high double digits. It was insane.
And he talks about, say, people who in Palestine who struggle financially. And he said for a lot of people in these places, they cannot risk having a high volatile asset such as Bitcoin because they have day-to-day costs. And maybe they could have a small amount in there and hopefully that'll appreciate in value. But some people live in hand to mouth. So something like tether has become super important in these markets. And when he explains to me the importance of that, I've had to check myself on criticisms of altcoins. And I think there are fair criticisms of them. But at the same time, if these are currently solving a problem for people, I find it hard to take a firm position against them.
Yeah, I've not been bearish on stable coins overall. I think that it's obviously an innovation. Like if anyone who tries sending money internationally, stable coins are an improvement.
Yeah.
It's just better technology. Obviously, I'd like to see them on Bitcoin, right? And so we've actually seen some announcements at the conference about being able to bring stable coins back to Bitcoin Lightning. So all else being equal, I'd like to see them there. But yeah, one of the few cases in altcoin land that actually has use case, I think, has been the stablecoin market. And Tether is an example, whether it runs on Ethereum or others. It can run on any, if a chain gets too expensive, it starts spilling onto another chain. And that is useful for people. And even like an example was Lebanon, where they're going through a major currency event. Even ones that were holding dollars in bank, that then is prone to confiscation, transferring back to the local currency. And so ironically, Tether ends up being safer for them than holding their dollars in a local bank. Whatever questions people might have about Tether's collateral or things like that, their ability to blacklist addresses, they look at that compared to what's happening in their local banking system. They're like, well, I'll take the Tethers. And so it is important for people, especially when there's not a big margin between your expenses and your income, to have a low volatility asset. And so that can mean different things to different people. I mean, currency is generally very low volatility over, say, a 2-month period, except for extreme events. Then you have gold that's more volatile than that. And then Bitcoin's obviously far more volatile than that. And that's actually one of the downsides longer term, is that there's then an inverse correlation between volatility and their ability to hold value long term. And so the cost of that volatility management is ongoing devaluation.